You believe you know the story of Adam and Eve. You have been told it ends with a slammed gate, a flaming sword flashing in the twilight to guard the way back to Eden, and two lonely figures walking into an unknown, desolate world. But what if I told you that was not the end at all? What if that was only the opening act of a much greater, more dangerous war, a war so foundational, so revealing of our true enemy, that for centuries, powerful forces tried to erase it from history? For over 60 years, a book lay buried in the dry sands of an Egyptian tomb, hidden from the eyes of the modern world. Now it has been found, and its pages preserved not by the West, but by the ancient and steadfast Ethiopian church tell a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the first man, the first woman, and the adversary who still hunts us today. This is the story of the lost book of Adam and Eve, and it holds a terrifying secret. In the coming hour, we will walk with Adam and Eve into the chilling darkness of the Cave of Treasures. We'll stand with them as they face the first deceptions after Eden, uncover the stories of sisters you never knew existed, and follow a sacred bloodline from the Mountain of Holiness to the terrifying giants that walked the earth before the flood. We will trace these secrets through Ethiopia's hidden, ancient manuscripts until they collide with the final, thunderous pages of Revelation. And to truly understand the secret, they hid the secret that is still relevant to our lives. Right now we must go back. We must go back to the tomb where that forbidden scroll was sealed. It all began in the sands of Upper Egypt, where the desert keeps its secrets better than any bank vault. For centuries, the wind and the slow march of time had buried a royal tomb under layers of suffocating silence. The name etched on the stone was almost forgotten, Tukenain, an Egyptian noble whose life had intersected with the whispers of early Christianity and the bustling trade routes of the ancient world. When archaeologists finally broke the seal, they expected the usual treasures, gold ornaments, pottery shards, and the fragments of a long-dead dynasty. What they found instead was stranger, and to some, far more dangerous. It was a bundle of ancient parchment, wrapped carefully in linen. It was not hidden in the main burial chamber with the gold, but in a concealed alcove, tucked away as if someone desperately wanted it protected. Or hidden. The script on these pages was not hieroglyphs. It was not written in the language of the pharaohs. It was written in an ancient Guizi script, the sacred, liturgical language of Ethiopia's oldest churches. Alongside these parchments lay a small cedar box, carved with a fascinating mix of symbols. Coptic crosses intertwined with a tree, a serpent, and two human figures. The lead archaeologist later admitted in a private letter, it was as if the tomb was a passageway between worlds Egypt, Ethiopia, and Eden itself. Inside that box was the text the world had not seen for centuries. Its title was The Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, what modern scholars would soon dub the Lost Book of Adam and Eve. When its first English translation was finally published in 1926, the academic world reacted as if someone had just detonated a theological bomb. The book did not rewrite Genesis. It continued it. It picked up the story the moment the gates slammed shut. It spoke of Adam and Eve's first nights in total darkness, their desperate prayers, their raw grief, and their direct, terrifying confrontations with Satan himself. For some, it was a priceless missing chapter in humanity's oldest story. For others, it was dangerous fiction. Very quickly, the debate turned into suppression. Prominent Western theologians and seminaries dismissed it with a single, damning label, pseudepigrapha, a forged work, they claimed, falsely attributed to ancient authors. That single label was enough to convince generations of students and churches to ignore it. The implication was clear: this is not inspired. This is not scripture. It has no authority. But in Ethiopia, the reaction was profoundly different. For them, this was not some apocryphal curiosity found in the sand. It was part of their living, breathing tradition. Ethiopian Christians had preserved this text within their broader canon for centuries, right alongside the Book of Enoch and other ancient writings that were systematically excluded from the Western Bible. They never saw it as a contradiction to Genesis. They saw it as a vital continuation, the necessary second chapter that filled the deafening silence between Eden's gate and the lives of Adam and Eve in exile. One Ethiopian scholar, when asked why his church still kept this book, gave a haunting and powerful answer. Genesis is the prologue. This is the battle. That single sentence strikes like a blade. It implies that Western Christianity has been reading only the opening lines of a war, unaware of how the first battle unfolded, what strategies the enemy used, or how the first humans learned to fight back. And if that battle is still raging today, which it is, then ignorance is the enemy's single greatest advantage. The more you study the book's history, the more it looks like a familiar pattern. Sacred texts emerging from the margins, embraced by one tradition, rejected and buried by another. The text survived not in the grand libraries of Europe, but in the stone-carved mountain monasteries of Ethiopia, guarded like a prophetic weapon. And this forces us to ask an investigative question that cannot be ignored. If the book of Adam and Eve was truly irrelevant or false, why did it survive for millennia in Ethiopia's sacred canon? Why did someone go to the trouble of hiding it in an Egyptian noble's tomb, wrapped and sealed as if it were a priceless treasure? And why, in 1926, did it appear in the West only to vanish again from public discourse? When you trace the trail, the suppression looks deliberate. The rejection was not based on archaeological evidence or fatal linguistic flaws. It was based on theology. The book speaks too much of spiritual warfare. It speaks too plainly of Satan's strategies. It speaks too vividly of the agonizing cost of obedience after the fall. It is not sanitized for polite, comfortable religion. It is raw, urgent, and uncomfortably close to our own reality. Which leaves us with the same choice the archaeologists had when they opened that cedar box. Do we close it again, label it pseudepigrapha, and pretend we never saw it, or do we dare to read what Adam and Eve themselves may have wanted us to know about the war that began the moment they left the garden? Because if Genesis is the prologue, then what is written in this book might just tell us how this war began and how it ends. And that takes us directly into the exile, into the cold, dark mouth of the Cave of Treasures, where the echoes of that first night outside Eden can still be heard. When the gates of Eden shut behind them, the very air they breathed changed. The fragrance of the garden, a constant perfume of life and unbroken fellowship, was gone. The earth beneath their feet was no longer soft and yielding. It was dry, cracked, and sharp with thorns. The light itself seemed thinner, as if the sun itself was grieving their separation from God. Adam and Eve were no longer clothed in the garments of light and glory. They were clothed only in the rough skins God Himself had sewn for them, coverings of mercy in a world that would now seek to wound them. The book of Adam and Eve describes their first journey as a stumbling, agonizing walk across a barren plain until they reached the mouth of a dark cave. It was no palace, no sanctuary of light. Yet this was to be their new dwelling. The Ethiopian tradition calls it the Cave of Treasures. The name sounds almost deceptive, a cruel irony. There were no jewels in that cave, no gold, no earthly riches. The treasure was something far more profound and far more dangerous to keep. It was the memory of God's presence and the fragile, flickering promise that one day, redemption would come. Inside, the air was cold and damp. Deep shadows clung to the walls like a physical entity. Adam and Eve had never truly known darkness before. In Eden, the day and the night were both filled with the ambient light of God's glory. Now, the blackness pressed against them, a suffocating force. Here, in this hollow of the earth, they were to begin their new life, not a life of comfort, but a life of training for war. The text says Adam fell on the floor of the cave and wept until his voice failed. Eve wept beside him, her body shaking, both of them utterly overwhelmed by the crushing, absolute weight of their separation. They had not just lost a home. They had lost their father's immediate presence. And it was here, in this moment of their deepest weakness, their most profound grief, that the enemy struck his first blow. Satan had not been idle since their expulsion. He had been watching. The book says he approached the mouth of the cave, not in a burst of triumphal rage, but with a cold, calculated malice. He was carrying with him the one weapon he knew could undo them completely: despair. In the suffocating silence of that first night, Adam heard a sound that was neither wind nor beast. A low, guttural wail began to rise from the darkness outside, growing into a howl so piercing, so filled with anguish, that it felt as though the very walls of the cave would split apart. This was not the roar of a predator hunting for food. It was the disembodied voice of hatred itself. The text describes it as a cry that entered into their bones, as if to shatter the last fragments of courage God had left in them. Eve clung to Adam, trembling. Adam pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound was inside his head, inside his spirit. And then, woven into the howl, came the words mocking, twisting, and aimed directly at the heart of hope. "Look at you now," the voice taunted. "From glory to dust. From the throne of the garden to this pit of darkness. You will never see the garden again. The one who made you has abandoned you. This darkness is your only home now." But in that cold cave, something happened that the enemy did not expect. Adam, his face still wet with tears, began to pray. These were not the easy, joyful prayers of Eden. This was the desperate, agonizing cry of a soul in exile. "O Lord," he cried out, "do not forsake the work of your hands. We have sinned, but do not abandon us." Eve's voice, though broken, joined his. And as their prayers rose, the darkness seemed to recoil. The oppressive weight in the cave lifted, and the howling outside faded into a frustrated shriek. The cave of treasures became, in that moment, more than a shelter. It became the first altar outside of Eden. It became the first battleground where prayer was not a peaceful ritual, but a desperate weapon. Here, Adam and Eve began to learn what all exiles must learn: that the absence of God's visible presence does not mean the absence of God. The Ethiopian tradition holds that in this cave, Adam kept certain sacred things given by God before the expulsion, symbols of a covenant yet to be fulfilled. It was a place of both profound grief and battlefield preparation, a holding ground for the promise that one day a son would come to crush the serpent's head. And perhaps that is why Satan's scream still matters. It was not just an outburst. It was an admission. The enemy knew, even outside Eden, that the war was not over. The cave of treasures, he feared, would forge warriors out of these broken people. The text ends this scene with Adam lifting his head from the dusty floor and saying, "We will not leave this cave until the Lord commands us." That is the resolve that makes the enemy tremble, not perfect circumstances, but unshakable loyalty in the worst of them. But in war, the enemy rarely strikes the same way twice. The first attack had been blunt, darkness, fear, despair. It had failed. Now Satan would return not with a scream, but with a disguise so beautiful it could almost pass for a blessing. The book of Adam and Eve tells us that one day, as Adam wandered a short distance from the cave in search of food, he saw a figure in the distance. The sun caught her skin, which was like polished onyx. Her hair was long and flowing, shimmering in the heat. She moved with a grace Adam had never seen outside of Eve herself. Her eyes held an intensity that seemed to pierce his very soul. And when she spoke, her voice carried the melody of rivers and the soft whisper of the wind. This woman was no ordinary stranger. She was a fabrication, a perfect illusion woven by the adversary himself. Every detail was calculated, not just to attract Adam, but to make him forget. Forget the pain of exile. Forget the warnings of God. Forget his sacred covenant with the woman who shared his life, his grief, and his calling. She spoke of comfort, of rest from the hardships of this new wilderness. She promised food without toil, shelter without labor, and companionship without the heavy demands of obedience. Then, her words grew bolder. "I can give you more than what you lost," she whispered. "Power over this land. Authority over all living things. No more fear, Adam. No more waiting for promises that never come." It was a masterstroke of temptation. In that moment, Adam's mind flashed with the memory of Eden, the fruit-laden trees, the cool shade, the rivers of life. His heart ached with loss, and his steps faltered. The temptation was not wrapped in rage or threat. It came dressed as kindness, as hope, as an answer. But deep within him, another memory stirred. It was the voice of God, the clear, unbending, and loving command given in Eden, a memory of true fellowship. The words of God rose like a wall between him and the illusion. That divine memory became a mirror, and in that mirror, the woman's beauty twisted. The eyes that seemed so inviting now glimmered with a cold malice. The voice that promised peace now dripped with contempt. Adam stepped back, and the mask slipped. The woman's form wavered, and in its place, the shadowed, furious figure of the enemy emerged, smiling, but with the cold smile of a predator who had nearly won. "Every blessing not from God," Adam said aloud, his voice shaking, "is a trap in disguise." The illusion shattered like glass. Satan's form twisted and retreated back into the wilderness, his plans for this day undone. But the battle had left its mark. Adam returned to the cave shaken, not because he had fallen, but because he realized how terrifyingly close he had come. The text records that Adam told Eve everything. They prayed through the entire night, asking God not just for protection, but for discernment, that they might see through any and every mask the enemy wore. This was the birth of spiritual vigilance. It was a profound, costly understanding that evil often comes dressed in the garments of good, that not every opportunity is a divine one, and that some doors that look like escape lead straight back into chains. For the Ethiopian tradition, this episode is more than ancient history. It is a critical warning for every generation. The most dangerous deceptions are not the ones we can easily recognize, but the ones that look just like the answers to our prayers. Adam learned in that moment what we must learn now. The enemy knows how to counterfeit light. He can weave desire, beauty, and promise into something that feels like destiny, but is designed to destroy. And so the cave of treasures became more than a refuge. It became a watchtower. For Adam knew the enemy would return. And next time, the disguise might be even harder to see. After the encounter with the enemy's beautiful, deadly disguise, Adam and Eve understood something profound. Their battle was not just against external monsters. It was against the corruption of their own desires. Purity was no longer a simple state of being, as it had been in Eden. It was now a fortress that had to be built and defended. They knew that even the most sacred gifts from God, including the command to be fruitful and multiply, could be twisted and corrupted if pursued outside of His perfect timing and command. And so, according to the book of Adam and Eve, they entered into a season unlike anything they had known, a period of intentional separation, prayer, and fasting before they would fully unite as husband and wife. The text records the number with a strange precision, 223 days. That is over 7 months of restraint, discipline, and constant watchfulness. Day after day, Adam would rise at the first light, his prayers echoing from one part of the cave, asking for God's blessing to rest upon his future union, asking for strength to lead his family in this new, hostile world. Eve, in her own space, would keep her vigil, her prayers weaving with his, petitioning for discernment and purity. They would meet, speak briefly, share the sparse food gathered from the wilderness, and then retreat again to their separate places of prayer. This was not a test of mere self-control, nor was it a rejection of the gift God had given them. It was a powerful declaration. It was a statement that their covenant, the very foundation of all future humanity, would not be founded on fleshly impulse or lonely desperation, but on divine appointment. In Eden, their union had been a gift, given instantly in perfection. In exile, it had to be contended for, purified, and prepared like a sacred offering. At last, the 223rd day came. God spoke, confirming the time was right, the preparation complete. Adam and Eve emerged from their season of waiting into the wilderness sun. The book describes the ceremony with a solemn, symbolic precision. God himself, in a manifestation of his presence, brought forth 3 gifts. These were the treasures of the cave, not a stone, but of promise, gold, myrrh, and frankincense. These were not random offerings. They were prophetic signposts, the first prophecy given after the fall. The gold, an emblem of kingship and purity, foreshadowed the divine, incorruptible reign of the Messiah who would one day come through their distant line. The myrrh, a bitter resin used for anointing and crucially for burial, foretold the immense suffering and sacrifice that would be required to purchase redemption. And the frankincense, the sweet fragrance of incense burned in worship, pointed to the future restoration of communion, the day when humanity's prayers could once again rise to God as a pleasing aroma. Centuries later, wise men from the East, guided by a star, would bring these exact same 3 gifts to a newborn child in Bethlehem, sealing the profound connection between the first covenant of marriage in exile and the ultimate covenant of salvation. But even this holy moment was not free from attack. The enemy, having failed with despair and failed with beauty, now sought to corrupt this sacred thing from within. The book says Satan watched their union from a distance, his mind spinning, whispering schemes into the air. His new strategy was insidious: turn their covenant into a chain, turn their love into hunger. Let them mistake desire for devotion. The implication is chilling. Marriage was not just a gift. It was now the first great battlefield of the human race. If the enemy could twist the purpose of this union, if he could poison the foundation of family, he could poison the legacy, the culture, and the future generations God intended to raise in righteousness. Adam and Eve, however, had been forged in hardship. They guarded their vows as one guards a city under siege, building their life not on fleeting passion, but on shared, costly obedience. From this union, children were born. First, Cain and Abel. And with them came the first bloodshed, a tragic victory for the enemy as brother turned against brother, staining the new earth with blood. But after that shadow, God gave another son, Seth, whose name means appointed. Eve herself said, "God has appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew." The book of Adam and Eve, alongside deep Ethiopian tradition, records that Seth was unlike his brothers. His countenance bore a quiet strength, and his heart leaned toward God from his earliest days. Adam, recognizing the calling on this son's life, set him apart. Seth was to be the new keeper of the covenant, the guardian of the original promise, the one who would preserve the sacred bloodline through which redemption would one day come. Under Adam's guidance, Seth and his descendants withdrew from the lowlands, where Cain's lineage was building cities and a culture of godless pride. They ascended to the high places, a region later known as Mount Hermon. There, the air was clean, the land was untouched by Cain's violence, and the people devoted themselves to worship, purity, and the remembrance of God's commands. For generations, the sons of Seth remained on this mountain of holiness, guarding themselves from the corruption below. But the war for the bloodline was about to escalate dramatically. While the West lost the details, the Ethiopian canon preserved the full, terrifying account in another of its lost books, the Book of Enoch. Genesis 5 gives us only a cryptic glimpse. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. But the Ethiopian manuscripts open the door to the life behind that mystery. The book begins with a warning, words written not for Enoch's time, but for a distant generation living in an age of great deception. It tells of angelic beings called the Watchers, guardians appointed by God to watch over humanity. But these Watchers, drawn by the beauty of human women, abandoned their posts. They descended from heaven to Mount Hermon, the same mountain where Seth's descendants lived, and made a pact. Led by one named Samjaza, they swore an oath that none would turn back from their plan. This was not a minor fall. It was a coordinated spiritual invasion. The unions between these fallen Watchers and human women produced offspring unlike any the world had ever seen, the Nephilim. Giants of immense size and power, fierce in war, violent, and morally corrupt. But the danger was not just in their physical strength. The Watchers taught humanity forbidden knowledge, sorcery, enchantments, the crafting of advanced weapons, the manipulation of nature, and forbidden astronomy that blurred the line between worship and idolatry. What they called wisdom was, in truth, a weapon against the order God had set. This brings us back to the Mountain of Holiness. The sons of Seth, looking down from their place of separation, began to hear the music from the valleys. They saw the festivals, the colors, and the striking, captivating beauty of the women below. One by one, the young men of Seth's holy line began to descend, telling themselves they would only look. But in the valley, they saw the daughters of men, and they took wives from among them, crossing the divine line between the holy and the profane. This was the master stroke of the enemy. The sacred bloodline, the line of Seth, began to mingle with the corrupted, rebellious line of Cain and the genetically altered line of the Nephilim. The scriptures in Genesis 6 say, "All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth." This was not poetic exaggeration. The corruption was not only moral, it was biological. The image of God in man was being distorted, the human bloodline itself being altered. The seed through which the Messiah was promised to come was under direct genetic siege. God's judgment, the flood, was not an act of random, impulsive wrath. It was a surgical strike. It was a genetic reset. It was a terrible, necessary act of cleansing to preserve humanity's original design. Scripture tells us Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. The Hebrew word tamim refers not just to moral integrity, but to physical wholeness, an untainted lineage. Noah's family was chosen because his line had remained pure, uncorrupted by the hybridization of the Watchers. The flood was not only an end. It was a divine intervention to save the future, to safeguard the promise made in Eden. Long after the waters of the flood receded, after Noah's sons spread across the continents and new nations rose and fell, there remained a threat of preservation, an unbroken line of guardianship that would find its home in the highlands of Ethiopia. While empires in the West and the Middle East shifted their borders, burned libraries, and rewrote their histories to suit new rulers, Ethiopia remained a fortress, both in its formidable geography and in its unbending faith. Its mountains, rising like ancient sentinels, shielded a people who did not merely read the scriptures. They lived them, and hidden in their hands were the very manuscripts the rest of the world had lost, suppressed, or forgotten. For millennia, Ethiopian monks have lived in monasteries carved from sheer, living rock, high above the valleys where time itself seems to move more slowly. These are not the ornate, gilded cathedrals of Europe. They are sanctuaries of stone hewn by hand, intentionally hidden from invaders and consecrated for one singular, solemn purpose: to guard the testimony entrusted to them. Among their sacred treasures are the two works the Western canon abandoned: the full book of Enoch and the book of Adam and Eve. To the Ethiopian Tuahedo Church, these are not mere curiosities or secondary apocryphal writings. They are integral, vital parts of the sacred record. Where the West saw them as dangerous, unnecessary, or theologically inconvenient, Ethiopia saw them as vital warnings, preserved specifically for the generations living in the shadow of the last days. The monks do not preserve these texts out of mere tradition. They believe them to be prophetic blueprints for recognizing the spiritual patterns that repeat again and again in human history. The rebellion of the Watchers, the agonizing exile of Adam and Eve, the seduction that led to the corruption of the bloodline, these are not stories locked in the ancient past. They are templates of how the enemy works, how humanity falls, and how God intervenes. For centuries, foreign powers tried to take these manuscripts. Some came with armies, others with gold, others still under the guise of neutral scholarship. But the guardians of this memory were not easily deceived. Manuscripts were hidden in underground chambers, sealed in stone libraries, where only the most trusted could enter. In some cases, the monks memorized entire books, so that even if the precious parchment was stolen or destroyed, the word itself would not perish. It is here the wave peak speaks with chilling clarity. When the West forgot, Ethiopia remembered. While Western Christianity gradually lost the full context of Genesis, stripping away the very layers that explain the spiritual war after Eden, Ethiopia kept the full narrative alive. When the West debated whether Enoch was mere allegory or myth, Ethiopia kept reading it as literal history and urgent prophecy. And when the story of Adam and Eve ended abruptly at Eden's gate in Western pulpits, Ethiopian believers continued the journey with them into the cave of treasures, learning how to fight the same enemy that still whispers in the darkness today. This is precisely why Ethiopia has often been targeted not only politically, but spiritually. If you can silence the guardians, you can cut off the world's access to the very warnings that could awaken it. But what does it mean to forget? This brings us back to the sons of Seth on their Mountain of Holiness. When they descended into the valley, they lost more than their physical location. They lost their identity. The book of Adam and Eve tells us that Adam's descendants, the line of Seth, once carried a clear, radiant memory of who they were, the chosen seed, appointed to guard the promise of restoration. But when they left their place of separation, when they mixed their holy calling with the culture of rebellion below, they lost more than their high ground. They lost their spiritual compass. They became wanderers not only across the land, but within their own souls. Here, the Ethiopian tradition draws a sobering, powerful parallel, a parallel that echoes with profound pain in the modern world. Just as the children of Eden drifted from their mountain, their identity blurring until it was gone, many peoples in history have been torn from their homelands, stripped their language, their culture, and their history until they no longer recognize themselves in the mirror. Among these, the experience of the African diaspora is perhaps one of the most striking and tragic examples. Millions were taken from their lands, scattered across foreign nations, and forced into brutal systems designed specifically to erase their heritage. This was not merely the theft of labor or freedom. It was the deliberate, systematic theft of identity. The songs, the stories, the family names, and the sacred lineages were deliberately severed, leaving only fragments. Generations grew up knowing, deep in their spirit, that they belonged to something greater, but unable to name it. In prophetic language, this is what exile truly means. Exile is not just about distance from a homeland. It is about a forced disconnection from your origin and your God-given purpose. When you no longer remember who you are, the enemy does not need to chain your body. Your mind and spirit are already bound. This is the modern cave. It is not a cave of stone, but a prison of the mind, a dark cell of forgetfulness. It is a state of being where people have been taught to despise their own reflection, to doubt their own worth, and to surrender their divine inheritance in exchange for the mere comfort of survival. It is here we encounter the wave-peak truth. The greatest theft is the theft of identity. When a person's identity is stolen, generations can live and die as captives without ever realizing they are in chains. They may work, build, and achieve, yet remain tragically far from the destiny for which they were created. But the Ethiopian tradition, which guarded the memory of the first exile, does not leave the story in despair. It insists that recovery is possible, but that recovery requires a return not merely to a geographical place, but to the knowledge of origin. For the children of Eden, the path back was to remember the covenant and the God who gave it. For those in any age, in any exile, the path is the same, to reject the lies about who you are and reclaim the truth of who God says you are. Adam's exile was physical. His descendants' exile became cultural and spiritual. Today's exile is often internal, hidden behind the appearance of freedom. Yet, the enemy's oldest strategy has never changed. If he cannot destroy you with a flood, he will try to make you forget who you are. And when you forget, you surrender your authority without a fight. But the story is not over, because even in the deepest exile, God preserves a remnant, a people who remember, a people who guard the truth. And in the mountains of Ethiopia, the guardians still whisper the warning. The patterns are returning. The days of Noah are not behind us. They are before us. For centuries, the Book of Enoch lay preserved in Ethiopia's high-altitude monasteries, serving as both a historical record and a dire warning. It was a chilling reminder of what happens when heavenly knowledge is twisted into weapons, when divine boundaries are violated. The Watchers descended with secrets not meant for human hands, and the world before the flood collapsed under the weight of that moral and genetic corruption. But if you think their story ended in the deep, fiery prison described by Enoch, you have missed the entire point. The spirit of the Watchers, the same arrogant rebellion, the same seduction of forbidden knowledge, still lives. Only now, it wears a different, far more sophisticated face. In our age, the tools have changed, but the pattern is identical. Where the Watchers taught the ancient world metalwork for weapons, sorcery for control, and enchantments for deception, our generation is unlocking technologies that carry the same apocalyptic potential. We call it progress, innovation, and the next frontier. But in the prophetic language preserved by the Guardians, it is simply the return of an old, devastating playbook. Artificial intelligence now learns faster than any human mind, absorbing the sum of all human knowledge, and then creating knowledge of its own, in its own image. Genomic editing tools like CRISPR promise to perfect human DNA, removing diseases, but also opening the terrifying door to altering, designing, and ultimately redefining what it even means to be human. Biological weapons, designed in hidden labs, now possess the power to end millions of lives without firing a single shot. Individually, each of these could be a tool for good. Together, they form a dangerous, intoxicating cocktail of power that, in the wrong hands, could erase the line between creation and creator for good. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers' gifts to humanity as knowledge that led astray. It was not the information itself that was evil. It was its use outside of God's boundaries and timing. The same is true now. AI could help feed the hungry, or it could enslave human thought itself. Genetic engineering could heal a child, or it could build a new, synthetic race no longer fully human. Advanced weaponry could protect the innocent or annihilate nations with the cold, indifferent push of a button. This is precisely why the Ethiopian church reads Enoch not as a dusty relic of ancient myth, but as a prophetic lens for our present reality. The parallels are too sharp to ignore. The ancient Watchers crossed a divine boundary. Today, our scientists and innovators stand on the bleeding edge of similar lines, and the question is no longer can we cross them, but should we? The rebellion of the Watchers was not just about knowledge. It was about authority. They did not want to serve under God's divine order. They wanted to set their own. This is the exact same spirit that drives so much of our unbridled technological ambition today, the belief that we can become the architects of our own evolution, that we can transcend our humanity without the God who gave it to us. Here the wave peak strikes with the force of a thunderclap. The ancient rebellion is now in silicon and steel. The divine boundaries that once existed in heaven and on earth are now being tested in laboratories, data centers, and corporate boardrooms. And just like in the days of Noah, the world applauds, calling it enlightenment, unaware that the same pattern of corruption is repeating. This is the final danger. The return of forbidden knowledge in our generation will not look like angels descending from the sky. It will look like innovation conferences, medical breakthroughs, and AI-powered revolutions. It will come to us wrapped as the ultimate solutions to our problems, just as Satan came to Adam disguised as a blessing. The West may have forgotten Enoch's warnings, but the patterns are playing out exactly as he described. The temptation is not only to use this knowledge, but to worship it, to treat technology as our savior, our healer, our provider, our God. And this brings us to the final act. The final book of the Bible, Revelation, pulls back the curtain on the climax of the story that began in Eden's garden. And in its opening chapter, John gives us a description of the risen Christ, an image that the Ethiopian tradition has long held literally, preserving a portrait that defies the sanitized, Europeanized depictions that dominate Western art. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. Revelation 1:14-15. This was not the pale, fragile Christ of medieval paintings, but a figure rooted in the earth, radiant in glory, his skin the color of burnished brass, and unmistakably fierce. This is the king who returns to confront the world system described in Revelation as Babylon the Great. Babylon is more than an ancient city. It is the symbol of a global network of oppression, greed, and idolatry that spans from Nimrod's tower to our present age. It is a system that seduces nations with wealth, enslaves souls through desire, and persecutes the righteous who refuse its mark. And just as the Watchers built cities of rebellion before the flood, so Babylon builds a final empire that unites politics, economics, and religion into a counterfeit kingdom. But God's people are not abandoned in this system. John is shown a vision of 144,000 sealed servants of God, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. While Western interpretations often treat them as symbolic, the Ethiopian and certain Hebraic traditions suggest they may be literal descendants of the tribes, scattered and hidden among the nations. Their identity was lost through centuries of exile, just as the children of Eden's covenant lost theirs. These could be communities long disconnected from their heritage, living in a modern cave of forgetfulness, yet marked and remembered in heaven for this precise, appointed time. Then comes the battle all of history has been building toward. The Black Messiah of Revelation returns, but not as the suffering servant. He comes as the conquering king. His robe is dipped in blood, a sign of victory over his enemies. On his head are many crowns, and on his thigh is written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The armies of heaven follow him. The beast and the kings of the earth gather to make war, but they fall, defeated by the word that proceeds from his mouth. Babylon the Great collapses in a single hour. The war ends. The curse that began in the garden is finally completely broken. The deceiver who tempted Eve, who corrupted the Watchers, and who seduced the nations, is cast into the lake of fire. The exile is over. The inheritance is restored. From the moment Adam and Eve stepped out of Eden, we have all been living in exile. The journey we have traced from the cave of treasures to the days of Enoch, through the flood, into Ethiopia's mountain guardians, and to the visions of Revelation has been one single, unbroken story. It is the story of a covenant attacked, nearly erased, yet guarded by a faithful remnant. The message for us today is to recognize that we are living in its final chapters. The patterns are returning. The lure of forbidden knowledge, the theft of identity, the seduction of counterfeit blessings, they are all here. Returning to the inheritance begins with remembering who we are. We are not accidents of history. We are the descendants of a covenant. To forget that is to remain in the modern cave, alive but living in the dark. The book of Adam and Eve teaches us that exile is a place of preparation, not permanent defeat. The book of Enoch warns us that the enemy's strategies repeat. Revelation promises us that the king will return. And so we arrive at the closing wave peak, a question that is both personal and prophetic. The first exile is ending. Will you return? This is not a call to nostalgia. It is a summons to step into the identity and authority you were always meant to have. To stand against the darkness as Adam was meant to, as Enoch did, as the 144,000 will. When the king comes, the gates of Eden will open again, not to lock us out, but to finally welcome us home. And in that moment, the inheritance will no longer be a promise. It will be our reality.